Some disappearances don't announce themselves with screams or struggle. They arrive quietly, in the space between a school bell and a front door that never opens. In the gap between a mother's glance at the clock and the moment she realizes her daughter should have been home an hour ago. This is a story about silence, the kind that settles over a small Texas town when a child vanishes on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind that grows heavier with each passing year, each unanswered question, each lead that dissolves into nothing. Texas, 1984. The year MTV played music videos on repeat, and Ronald Reagan campaigned for re-election. The year when personal computers were still a luxury, and missing children's faces appeared on milk cartons instead of social media feeds. The year when a little girl walked out of her elementary school and into a void that would swallow her whole. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, 8 years old, light brown hair that caught the sun, a pink sweater with geometric patterns her grandmother had bought her for Christmas, white sneakers that squeaked on linoleum floors, a girl who loved reading books about horses and always finished her homework before dinner. She was supposed to walk 3 blocks home. She never made it. For decades her case file gathered dust in a metal cabinet at the local police station. Witnesses faded from memory, evidence degraded. Hope withered like wildflowers on a Texas roadside in August. But silence, as it turns out, is not permanent. Sometimes it breaks. Sometimes, after 40 years, the truth claws its way back to the surface. Not through dramatic confessions or sudden breakthroughs, but through the patient, methodical work of people who refuse to let a child be forgotten. This is the story of Sarah Mitchell, the little girl who never came home from school, and the cold case that finally, impossibly, found its resolution. The Mitchell family lived on Oakwood Drive, a quiet street in a suburb 20 miles outside of Houston. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on, where front doors stayed unlocked and parents waved to each other from driveways. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Robert and Linda Mitchell had moved there in 1979, drawn by good schools and affordable housing. Robert worked as an accountant for an oil company. Linda taught piano lessons from their living room. They had 2 children, Sarah, their youngest, and her older brother David, who was 12. By all accounts, they were an ordinary family. Sarah attended Pinewood Elementary, a single-story brick building with a playground and a flagpole out front. She was in 3rd grade. Her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, would later describe her as quiet but engaged, the kind of student who always raised her hand and never caused trouble. On the morning of October 16, 1984, Sarah woke up at 7 o'clock. Linda made her breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast. Orange juice in a plastic cup. Sarah ate slowly, reading the back of a cereal box. David complained about a math test. Robert kissed them both goodbye and left for work. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way. Linda drove both children to school at 8:15. She watched them walk through the front entrance, Sarah's pink sweater bright against the brick. She waved. Sarah waved back. That was the last time Linda Mitchell saw her daughter alive. The school day ended at 3 o'clock. Sarah's routine was simple and consistent. She would walk out the front entrance with her classmates, cross the parking lot, and head down Maple Street. 3 blocks north, then a right turn onto Oakwood Drive. 10 minutes, maybe 12 if she stopped to look at something interesting. Linda expected her home by 3:15. By 3:30, she felt the first flutter of concern. By 3:45, she was standing on the front porch scanning the street. By 4 o'clock, she was calling neighbors. No one had seen Sarah. Linda called the school. The secretary confirmed that Sarah had been in class all day. Mrs. Henderson said she'd seen Sarah leave with the other students at dismissal. Everything had been normal. Linda called Robert at work. He left immediately. By 4:30, they were driving the route Sarah should have taken. Slowly, methodically, checking every yard, every alley, every place a child might have stopped or wandered. Nothing. At 5:15, Robert Mitchell called the police. The first officers arrived at 6 o'clock. They took statements, descriptions, recent photographs. They asked the questions that every parent dreads. Had Sarah seemed upset? Had there been any arguments? Any strangers in the neighborhood? Any reason she might have run away? No, 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 no. The officers were professional but not yet alarmed. Children wandered off. They got distracted. They went to a friend's house and forgot to call home. Most of the time, they turned up within a few hours, sheepish and unharmed. But as the sun set over Oakwood Drive, and the streetlights flickered on and Sarah's empty bedroom remained empty, the nature of the situation began to shift. This wasn't a child who had wandered off. This was a child who had vanished. By 8 o'clock, more officers had arrived. Neighbors gathered in clusters on the street, whispering, worried. Flashlights swept through backyards and vacant lots. Someone organized a search party. Volunteers combed the area, calling Sarah's name into the darkness. The night stretched on. No one found anything. By midnight, the Mitchell house was full of people, police officers, detectives, family members. A victim advocate who spoke in soft, careful tones. Linda sat on the couch, clutching a photograph of Sarah, her face pale and frozen. Robert stood by the window, staring out at the street, as if willing his daughter to appear. David sat alone in his room, silent and terrified, and somewhere in the vast darkness of Texas, Sarah Mitchell was gone. The investigation began in earnest the next morning. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood. They interviewed teachers, classmates, parents. They reviewed Sarah's last known movements, constructing a timeline minute by minute. Sarah had left the school at 3 o'clock with approximately 200 other students. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing her walk across the parking lot. She had been alone, carrying her backpack, heading in the direction of home. After that, the trail went cold. No one remembered seeing her on Maple Street. No one saw her turn onto Oakwood Drive. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the afternoon air. Detectives focused on the 3-block route. They knocked on every door, questioned every resident. Had anyone seen Sarah? Had anyone noticed anything unusual? A strange car? An unfamiliar person? Most people had been at work or inside their homes. The few who had been outside remembered nothing. One witness, an elderly man named Mr. Carlson, said he'd been watering his lawn around 3:15. He lived on Maple Street, 1 block from the school. He thought he might have seen a girl in a pink sweater, but he couldn't be sure. He hadn't paid much attention. It was the closest thing to a lead they had. Detectives also looked inward. Statistically, most crimes against children are committed by someone they know, family members, friends, acquaintances. Robert and Linda Mitchell were questioned extensively. Their finances were examined, their backgrounds checked. Neighbors were asked about the family dynamics. Nothing raised suspicion. David was interviewed gently, carefully. He had been at school all day, confirmed by teachers and classmates. He had no information about his sister's disappearance. The investigation expanded outward. Sex offenders in the area were identified and questioned. Known predators were tracked down and alibis verified. Tips began to pour in from the public. Each one followed up, each one leading nowhere. Days turned into weeks. The search continued, but hope was fading. To understand what was lost, you have to understand who Sarah Mitchell was. Not just a name in a case file, not just a photograph on a missing persons flyer, but a real child with a real life, in a real place. Sarah was born on March 12, 1976, at Houston Methodist Hospital. She weighed 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Linda would later say that Sarah had been an easy baby, calm and observant, with wide eyes that seemed to take in everything. As a toddler, Sarah was quiet but curious. She loved animals, especially horses. She would sit for hours with picture books, tracing the illustrations with her finger. When she learned to read, she devoured every book she could find about horses, cowboys, and the Old West. Her favorite was a worn paperback called Misty of Chincoteague. She read it so many times the spine cracked and pages fell out. Linda taped it back together. Sarah kept reading. By the time she started school, Sarah had developed a gentle, thoughtful personality. She wasn't the loudest kid in class, but she was well liked. She had a small group of close friends. She preferred quiet games to rough play. She was the kind of child who noticed when someone was sad and tried to help. Mrs. Henderson, her third-grade teacher, would later tell investigators that Sarah was one of her best students. She always completed her assignments. She never disrupted class. She raised her hand before speaking and said please and thank you without being reminded. She was, in every sense, a good kid. The Mitchell home on Oakwood Drive was a modest single-story ranch house with a brick facade and a small front yard. Inside, it was warm and lived in. Family photographs lined the hallway. Linda's piano sat in the living room, sheet music stacked on top. The kitchen had floral wallpaper and wooden cabinets. Sarah's bedroom was at the end of the hall. It was small but cozy. A twin bed with a patchwork quilt. A bookshelf overflowing with paperbacks. A desk where she did her homework. Posters of horses on the walls. A stuffed animal collection arranged carefully on a shelf. After she disappeared, Linda couldn't bring herself to change anything. The room remained exactly as Sarah had left it. The homework on the desk, the book on the nightstand. The pink sweater she'd worn that morning still smelled faintly of her shampoo. It became a shrine, a frozen moment in time. Pinewood Elementary was a typical Texas public school in the 1980s. Single-story brick construction, long hallways with linoleum floors, classrooms with chalkboards and bulletin boards covered in student artwork. A cafeteria that smelled like industrial meatloaf and canned green beans. The playground had swings, a slide, and a set of monkey bars. During recess, kids played kickball and foursquare. Teachers supervised from the shade of a covered walkway. Sarah's third-grade classroom was in the East Wing. Mrs. Henderson had been teaching for 15 years. She was strict but fair, the kind of teacher who expected effort and rewarded kindness. Sarah sat in the second row, third seat back. Her desk was neat. Her handwriting was careful and precise. She turned in every assignment on time. Her classmates would later describe her as nice but shy. She didn't talk much during recess. She usually sat on the swings with her best friend, a girl named Emily Carter. They would talk about books and horses and what they wanted to be when they grew up. Emily wanted to be a veterinarian. Sarah wanted to be a writer. On the morning of October 16, 1984, Sarah had been in class as usual. She'd participated in a spelling lesson. She'd eaten lunch in the cafeteria with Emily. She'd played on the swings during afternoon recess. At 3 o'clock, the bell rang. Students poured out of classrooms, backpacks slung over shoulders, voices loud and excited. It was Tuesday, which meant no homework in Mrs. Henderson's class. The kids were happy. Sarah walked out with the crowd. Emily's mother was picking her up that day, so the two girls said goodbye at the front entrance. Emily would later tell police that Sarah had seemed normal, happy even. She'd waved and said, "See you tomorrow." Sarah walked across the parking lot. And then she was gone. The neighborhood where Sarah disappeared was quintessentially suburban Texas in the 1980s. Wide streets lined with ranch-style homes, lawns that required constant watering in the brutal summer heat. Driveways with pickup trucks and station wagons, basketball hoops mounted above garage doors, chain-link fences separating backyards. It was a working-class area. Most families had two incomes. Parents worked long hours. Kids were expected to be independent, to walk to school and back, to entertain themselves until dinner. It was a different time, a time before cell phones and GPS tracking, a time when stranger danger was a vague concept, not a constant fear. A time when children moved through the world with a freedom that would seem reckless by modern standards. But it wasn't a lawless place. People looked out for each other. Neighbors knew each other's names. If a kid got hurt, someone would help. If a car drove too fast down the street, someone would complain. It was safe, or at least it had always felt safe, until Sarah Mitchell disappeared. In the days following her vanishing, the neighborhood transformed. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone. Carpools were organized. Playdates were supervised. Doors that had once stayed unlocked were now bolted shut. Fear settled over Oakwood Drive like a fog. People whispered. Theories circulated. Some believed Sarah had been abducted by a stranger. Others thought she'd wandered off and gotten lost. A few, in hushed tones, wondered if someone in the neighborhood was responsible. Suspicion poisoned relationships. Mr. Carlson, the elderly man who'd been watering his lawn, found himself under scrutiny. Why had he been outside at that exact time? Why couldn't he remember more details? A man who lived 2 streets over, a quiet bachelor who kept to himself, was questioned multiple times. He had no alibi. He had no criminal record. But he was different, and different was enough to make people nervous. The investigation found nothing to implicate either man, but the damage was done. The neighborhood would never feel the same. Linda Mitchell stopped teaching piano lessons. She couldn't focus. Couldn't sit at the instrument without thinking of Sarah, who used to sit beside her on the bench, picking out simple melodies with one finger. Robert continued going to work, but his performance suffered. He was distracted, hollow-eyed, moving through his days like a ghost. David withdrew. He stopped hanging out with friends, stopped playing basketball. He spent hours in his room, door closed, silent. At school, his grades dropped. Teachers noticed but didn't know what to say. The family was fracturing. Grief and uncertainty were pulling them apart, each member isolated in their own private hell. Linda clung to hope. She kept Sarah's room pristine. She answered every phone call from the police, no matter how small the update. She organized search parties, printed flyers, appeared on local news broadcasts, pleading for information. Robert, on the other hand, began to retreat into a darker place. He didn't talk about hope. He talked about what he would do if he ever found the person responsible. His anger was a living thing, coiled tight, waiting. David said nothing. He was 12 years old, and his sister was gone, and no one could tell him why. The media coverage was intense at first. Local news stations ran stories every night. Newspapers printed Sarah's photograph on the front page. Volunteers distributed flyers throughout the county. A tip line was established. But as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, the coverage began to fade. Other stories took precedence. Other tragedies demanded attention. Sarah Mitchell became another name on a growing list of missing children. Her case file remained open, but active investigations slowed. Detectives moved on to other cases. The tip line went quiet. The Mitchells were left alone with their grief. And somewhere in the silence, the truth waited. October 16, 1984 was an ordinary day until it wasn't. The weather was mild for Texas in October, temperatures in the mid-70s, clear skies. A light breeze that carried the scent of cut grass and distant oil refineries. At Pinewood Elementary, the day unfolded like any other. Morning announcements over the intercom, the Pledge of Allegiance, math lessons and spelling tests. Lunch in the cafeteria, recess on the playground. Sarah Mitchell moved through her routine without incident. She answered questions in class. She ate her sandwich and apple slices at lunch. She swung on the swings with Emily during recess, talking about a book they'd both read. At 2:45, Mrs. Henderson dismissed the class for the day. Students packed their backpacks. Chairs scraped against linoleum. Voices rose in excitement. The school day was over. At 3 o'clock, the bell rang. The hallways filled with children, locker doors slammed. Teachers stood at their classroom doors waving goodbye. The front entrance became a bottleneck of small bodies pushing toward freedom. Sarah walked out with the crowd. Multiple witnesses would later confirm this. Mrs. Henderson saw her leave. The school secretary, Mrs. Palmer, was standing near the front door and noticed Sarah's pink sweater. A parent picking up her own child remembered seeing a girl matching Sarah's description. Sarah crossed the parking lot. She was alone. Her backpack was slung over one shoulder. She walked with purpose, heading north toward Maple Street. This was the last confirmed sighting. After this moment, Sarah Mitchell ceased to exist in any verifiable way. The route from Pinewood Elementary to the Mitchell home was straightforward. Exit the school parking lot. Turn left onto Maple Street. Walk 3 blocks north, passing residential homes and a small corner store. Turn right onto Oakwood Drive. Walk 2 more blocks. Total distance, approximately half a mile. Total time, 10 to 12 minutes. Sarah had walked this route dozens of times. She knew it by heart. There were no busy intersections, no dangerous crossings. It was a safe residential path. But somewhere along that half-mile stretch, something went wrong. Detectives reconstructed the timeline with painstaking detail. 3 o'clock. Sarah leaves school. 3:02. She crosses the parking lot, heading toward Maple Street. 3:05. Missed her. Carlson, watering his lawn on Maple Street, possibly sees a girl in a pink sweater. He's not certain, he doesn't pay close attention. 3:10. Sarah should be halfway home, somewhere on Maple Street. 3:15. Sarah should be arriving home. 3:30. Linda Mitchell begins to worry. 4 o'clock, Linda calls neighbors. 4:30. Robert Mitchell arrives home. They drive the route, searching. 5:15. Police are called. Somewhere between 3:02 and 3:15, Sarah vanished. 13 minutes, that's all it took. The initial search focused on the immediate area. Officers walked the route, checking yards, alleys, and vacant lots. They looked for signs of struggle, discarded belongings, anything that might indicate what had happened. They found nothing. No backpack, no shoes, no torn clothing, no blood. It was as if Sarah had been plucked from the sidewalk and erased. Detectives interviewed everyone who lived along Maple Street and Oakwood Drive. Most people had been inside their homes at 3 o'clock. Those who had been outside remembered nothing unusual. One woman, Mrs. Delgado, said she'd been getting her mail around 3:10. She didn't see Sarah, but she did notice a car parked on the street. A dark-colored sedan, maybe blue or black. She didn't think much of it at the time. When pressed for details, she couldn't remember the make or model. She hadn't seen the driver. She wasn't even sure if the car was still there when she went back inside. It was a lead, but a thin one. Detectives canvassed the area, looking for anyone who owned a dark sedan. They found several. Each owner was questioned. Each had an alibi or a plausible explanation. The lead went nowhere. The search expanded. Volunteers combed nearby parks, wooded areas, and empty fields. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the landscape. Search dogs were brought in, given Sarah's scent from her clothing. The dogs tracked her scent from the school to a point on Maple Street, approximately 1 block from the school. Then the trail ended, abruptly, completely. The handlers said this suggested Sarah had gotten into a vehicle at that location. It was the first concrete indication that Sarah had been abducted. The realization hit the Mitchell family like a physical blow. Abducted. The word carried a weight that was almost unbearable. It meant Sarah hadn't wandered off. She hadn't gotten lost. Someone had taken her. Someone had put her in a car and driven away. Linda collapsed when the detective told her. Robert's face went blank. His jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. David overheard from the hallway. He ran to his room and locked the door. The investigation shifted. This was no longer a missing child case. This was a potential kidnapping, possibly worse. Detectives compiled a list of known sex offenders in the area. There were 3 within a 10-mile radius. The first was a man named Gerald Hicks, convicted in 1978 of indecent exposure. He lived in a trailer park 5 miles from the school. Detectives questioned him. He had no alibi for the afternoon of October 16th, but there was no evidence linking him to Sarah's disappearance. His vehicle was searched. Nothing was found. The second was a man named Raymond Poole, convicted in 1980 of attempted sexual assault of a minor. He lived with his mother in a house 3 miles from Oakwood Drive. He claimed he'd been at work on October 16th. His employer confirmed this. His vehicle didn't match the description of the dark sedan. The third was a man named Leonard Briggs, convicted in 1975 of child molestation. He lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. He had no alibi. He owned a dark blue sedan. Detectives obtained a search warrant. They tore his house apart. They found nothing, no evidence of Sarah, no children's clothing, no photographs, no signs of violence. Briggs was questioned for hours. He denied any involvement. He passed a polygraph test. Without evidence, they had to let him go. Tips poured in from the public. Someone claimed to have seen a girl matching Sarah's description at a gas station in Louisiana. Detectives followed up. It wasn't her. Someone else reported seeing a man forcing a child into a car near the school. The description was vague. The lead went nowhere. A psychic called, claiming to have visions of Sarah in a wooded area near water. Searchers checked every pond, creek, and reservoir in the county. They found nothing. Weeks passed. The investigation was stalling. Detectives had no physical evidence, no witnesses, no suspects. The trail had gone cold almost immediately, and despite their best efforts, they couldn't find a way forward. The Mitchells appeared on local news, pleading for information. Linda's voice shook as she spoke. "If you have Sarah, please just let her come home. We won't press charges, we just want her back." Robert sat beside her, silent, his hands clenched into fists. The broadcast aired. The phone lines lit up, but none of the tips led anywhere. By December, the active search had effectively ended. Sarah's case remained open, but detectives had exhausted their leads. The files sat on a desk, growing thicker with dead ends and false hopes. The Mitchells refused to give up. Linda continued printing flyers. She mailed them to police departments across the state. She contacted national organizations that specialized in missing children. Robert became obsessed with the case. He spent hours reviewing the police reports, looking for something the detectives had missed. He drove the route Sarah had taken over and over, as if repetition might reveal a hidden clue. David stopped talking about his sister. At school, when classmates asked, he would shrug and change the subject. At home, he avoided the living room where Sarah's photograph sat on the mantel. He was learning to live with absence. Christmas came. The Mitchells didn't decorate. They didn't exchange gifts. They sat in their living room silent, staring at the empty space where Sarah should have been. Linda cried. Robert drank. David stayed in his room. Outside, the neighborhood was strung with lights and filled with the sounds of celebration. Inside the Mitchell house, there was only silence. The investigation into Sarah Mitchell's disappearance was thorough, methodical, and ultimately frustrating. Detectives worked the case hard in those first few months. They followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. They interviewed hundreds of people. They reviewed hours of footage from security cameras at nearby businesses. They coordinated with state and federal agencies, but the case refused to break. Lead Detective Frank Morales, a 20-year veteran of the department, would later describe it as one of the most baffling cases of his career. "We had nothing," he said in a 2010 interview. "No witnesses, no physical evidence, no clear motive. It was like she just evaporated." The investigation focused on several key areas. First, the immediate vicinity of the disappearance. Detectives mapped every home, every business, every vacant lot within a 2-mile radius of Pinewood Elementary. They conducted door-to-door interviews, asking the same questions over and over, hoping someone would remember something new. They didn't. Second, the victim's family and social circle. Statistically, most crimes against children are committed by someone close to them. Detectives looked hard at Robert and Linda Mitchell, at David, at extended family members, at neighbors, at teachers. They found nothing suspicious. Robert and Linda's marriage was solid. Their finances were stable. There were no signs of abuse or neglect. David was a typical 12-year-old, struggling with adolescence, but otherwise unremarkable. Teachers described Sarah as a happy, well-adjusted child. Friends said the same. There were no red flags. Third, known offenders. Every registered sex offender within a 50-mile radius was identified, located, and questioned. Alibis were checked. Vehicles were searched. Polygraphs were administered. None of them panned out. Fourth, the possibility of a stranger abduction. This was the most likely scenario, and also the most difficult to investigate. A stranger could be anyone. Someone passing through town, someone with no connection to Sarah or her family, someone who saw an opportunity and took it. Without witnesses or physical evidence, there was no way to identify such a person. Detectives also explored less conventional avenues. They consulted with FBI profilers who provided a psychological profile of the likely abductor. The profile suggested a white male, aged 25 to 40, with a history of sexual offenses or deviant behavior. Someone who lived or worked in the area. Someone who had likely been watching Sarah before the abduction. It was useful in theory, but in practice it didn't narrow the suspect pool significantly. They worked with forensic artists to create composite sketches based on vague witness descriptions. The sketches were distributed to the media and posted in public places. No one recognized the faces. They even brought in a psychic at Linda Mitchell's request. The psychic claimed to sense Sarah's presence near water, in a place with trees and darkness. Searchers checked every location that fit the description. They found nothing. One of the most promising leads came in late November. A woman named Carol Jensen called the tip line. She said she'd been driving through the neighborhood on the afternoon of October 16th, around 3:15. She'd seen a dark-colored car parked on Maple Street, near the corner where the search dogs had lost Sarah's scent. She remembered it because the car had been idling, engine running, but no one was inside, or at least no one she could see. The windows were tinted. She'd thought it was odd at the time, but hadn't thought much of it until she saw the news coverage about Sarah. Detectives were excited. This corroborated Mrs. Delgado's earlier statement about a dark sedan. It placed a suspicious vehicle at the exact location where Sarah's trail had ended. They pressed Carol for details. What kind of car? She wasn't sure. Maybe a Chevy or a Ford, something common. What color exactly? Dark blue, maybe black. She couldn't be certain. Did she see a license plate? No. Did she see anyone near the car? No. It was frustrating. The lead was tantalizing but ultimately too vague to pursue effectively. Detectives checked registration records for dark sedans in the area. There were hundreds. They couldn't investigate them all without more specific information. The lead stalled. By early 1985, the investigation had hit a wall. Detectives had exhausted their immediate leads. The case was still open, still active, but there was nowhere left to go. They were waiting for a break, a new witness, a piece of evidence, a confession, something, anything. But nothing came. The Mitchells grew increasingly desperate. Linda contacted every missing children's organization she could find. She sent Sarah's photograph and information to police departments across the country. She appeared on television shows, radio programs, anywhere that would give her a platform. Robert hired a private investigator, a former cop named Tom Brennan. Brennan reviewed the case file, conducted his own interviews, and came to the same conclusion as the police. There was simply no evidence to follow. He refunded half of Robert's money and apologized. David, meanwhile, was struggling. His grades had plummeted. He'd stopped participating in extracurriculars. He spent most of his time alone, withdrawn and uncommunicative. The school counselor recommended therapy. Robert and Linda couldn't afford it. The family was disintegrating. In March 1985, 6 months after Sarah's disappearance, the case was officially classified as a cold case. This didn't mean the investigation was closed. It meant that active leads had been exhausted, and the case would now be reviewed periodically rather than worked daily. Detective Morales promised the Mitchells that he wouldn't give up, that he would continue to follow any new leads that emerged. That Sarah's case would never be forgotten, but the reality was clear. Without new evidence, the case was going nowhere. The years that followed were brutal. The Mitchells tried to move forward, but how do you move forward when your child is missing? When every day is a reminder of absence, when every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday is a wound that never heals? Linda threw herself into advocacy work. She joined support groups for families of missing children. She volunteered with organizations that distributed flyers and organized searches. It gave her a sense of purpose, a way to channel her grief into something productive. Robert became bitter. He stopped talking about Sarah. He stopped hoping. He went to work, came home, drank beer in front of the television, and went to bed. He and Linda barely spoke. Their marriage, once strong, was now held together by nothing more than shared trauma. David left for college in 1990 and never came back. He loved his parents, but he couldn't be in that house anymore. Couldn't live in the shadow of his sister's ghost. He moved to California, got a job, started a new life. He called on holidays, he sent cards, but he didn't visit. The Mitchell house on Oakwood Drive became a mausoleum. Sarah's room remained untouched. Her photographs lined the walls. Her absence filled every corner, and the case file sat in a metal cabinet at the police station, gathering dust. Over the years, there were occasional developments. In 1987, a body was found in a field 30 miles from Houston. It was a young girl, approximately the right age. The Mitchells were contacted. DNA testing was still in its infancy, but dental records were compared. It wasn't Sarah. In 1992, a man was arrested in Louisiana for the abduction and murder of a child. During questioning, he mentioned other victims. Detectives from multiple states, including Texas, sent case files. Sarah's information was included. The man denied any involvement in her disappearance. There was no evidence linking him to the case. In 1998, a woman called the tip line, claiming to be Sarah. She said she'd been held captive for years but had finally escaped. Detectives investigated. It was a hoax. Each false lead was a fresh wound. Each time the phone rang, Linda's heart would leap with hope, only to be crushed again. By the early 2000s, the case was all but forgotten. Detective Morales had retired. The case had been passed to younger detectives who had their own active investigations to manage. Sarah's file was reviewed occasionally, but there was nothing new to pursue. The Mitchells had aged. Linda's hair had gone grey. Robert's health was failing. They still lived in the same house, still kept Sarah's room the same, still hoped, in some quiet, desperate way, that they would get answers. But hope was fading. And then, in 2019, something changed. Time is a strange thing when you're waiting for answers that never come. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, months into years, and eventually the sharp edges of grief dull into something more manageable. Not gone, never gone, but quieter. For the Mitchells, the passage of time was both a mercy and a curse. It allowed them to function, to go through the motions of living, but it also meant that Sarah was slipping further away. Her face in their memories was fading, replaced by the static image in photographs. Her voice was gone, her laugh was gone. All that remained was absence. By the mid-1990s, the investigation into Sarah's disappearance had effectively stopped. The case file was still open technically, but no one was actively working it. Detective Morales had retired in 1993. His replacement, a younger detective named Karen Hughes, inherited a backlog of cold cases. Sarah's was one of dozens. Hughes reviewed the file when she first took over. She saw the same dead ends, the same lack of evidence, the same frustrating absence of leads. She made a few phone calls, checked in with the Mitchells, but there was nothing new to pursue. The case went back into the cabinet. Linda Mitchell never stopped searching. Even as the years passed, even as hope became a fragile, flickering thing, she refused to give up. She maintained contact with missing children's organizations. She updated Sarah's information on national databases. She participated in online forums where families of missing persons shared information and supported each other. In 1996, when the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children began creating age progression images, Linda submitted Sarah's photograph. An artist used computer software to predict what Sarah might look like at age 20. The image was haunting. A young woman with light brown hair and familiar eyes. A stranger, but also recognizable. Linda stared at the image for hours, trying to reconcile the child she remembered with this adult she would never know. The age progression image was distributed to law enforcement agencies and posted online. It generated a few tips, but none led anywhere. Robert Mitchell gave up, not consciously, not all at once. But gradually, over the years, he stopped believing that Sarah would be found. He stopped talking about the case. He stopped hoping. In 1999, he suffered a heart attack. He survived, but his health never fully recovered. He retired from his job and spent most of his time at home, watching television, reading the newspaper, existing. Linda tried to reach him, to pull him back, but he was gone in all the ways that mattered. Their marriage was a shell. They lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, but they were strangers. Grief had carved out the space between them, and neither had the energy to bridge it. David Mitchell built a life in California. He got married in 1995. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl. He worked as an engineer for a tech company. He was, by all outward appearances, successful and happy. But he never talked about his sister. His wife knew the basics. That he'd had a younger sister who disappeared when he was 12, that it had been traumatic, that he didn't like to discuss it. She didn't push. His children didn't know. He'd never told them. How do you explain something like that? How do you tell your kids that their aunt vanished when she was 8 years old and was never found? He told himself he would tell them someday, when they were older, when they could understand. But someday never came. The neighborhood where Sarah disappeared had changed. Families moved away. New families moved in. The children who had attended Pinewood Elementary in 1984 were now adults with children of their own. The teachers had retired. The principal had passed away. The memory of Sarah Mitchell faded. Oakwood Drive was just another suburban street. The houses looked the same, but the people were different. No one remembered the little girl in the pink sweater who had walked out of school one Tuesday afternoon and never came home, except for the Mitchells. They were still there, in the same house, living with the ghost of their daughter. In the early 2000s, advances in forensic technology began to change the landscape of cold case investigations. DNA analysis, which had been rudimentary in the 1980s, was now sophisticated and reliable. Databases were being created, linking evidence from unsolved crimes across the country. Cases that had been impossible to solve decades earlier were suddenly being reopened. But Sarah's case had no DNA evidence. No body had been found. No physical evidence had been collected. There was nothing to test. The case remained cold. In 2010, Detective Hughes retired. The case was passed to another detective, then another. Each one reviewed the file, saw the same dead ends, and moved on to cases with more promising leads. Sarah Mitchell became a name in a database, a photograph in a file, a statistic. One of thousands of children who had disappeared and never been found. Linda Mitchell turned 70 in 2015. She was frail, her body worn down by decades of stress and grief. She still kept Sarah's room exactly as it had been. She still updated the missing persons databases. She still hoped in some small, stubborn way that she would get answers before she died. Robert was in worse shape. His heart condition had worsened. He was on multiple medications. He rarely left the house. They didn't talk about Sarah anymore. There was nothing left to say, and then in 2019 a phone call changed everything. It came on a Tuesday morning in March. Linda was in the kitchen making coffee. Robert was in the living room watching the news. The phone rang. Linda answered. "Mrs. Mitchell? This is Detective James Carver with the Houston Police Department. I'm calling about your daughter's case." Linda's hand tightened on the phone. She'd received calls like this before. False leads, hoaxes, dead ends. She braced herself for disappointment, but this time was different. "We've reopened Sarah's case," Detective Carver said, "and we have new information." The call from Detective James Carver was the first real hope the Mitchells had felt in decades. Carver was part of a newly formed cold case unit within the Houston Police Department. The unit had been created in 2018, funded by a grant specifically aimed at using modern forensic technology to solve old cases. Carver and his team were systematically reviewing unsolved disappearances and homicides from the 1980s and 1990s. Sarah Mitchell's case was on their list. "We've been going through old files," Carver explained to Linda over the phone, "and we've identified several cases from that era that might be connected. We're using new investigative techniques, including genetic genealogy and advanced database searches. We'd like to reopen Sarah's case and see if we can finally get you some answers." Linda's voice shook. "After all this time?" "Yes, ma'am," Carver said. "I know it's been a long time, but technology has come a long way. Things that were impossible in 1984 are routine now. I can't make any promises, but I want to try." Linda hung up and told Robert. For the first time in years, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Hope. Detective Carver and his team began by reviewing the original case file. They read every report, every witness statement, every tip that had been called in. They studied the timeline, the search efforts, the suspects who had been questioned and cleared. They saw the same frustrations that Detective Morales had faced 35 years earlier. No physical evidence, no witnesses, no clear leads. But they also saw opportunities. In 1984, there had been no surveillance cameras in the neighborhood, no cell phone records, no social media, no digital footprint. But there had been people, and people left traces. Carver's team began re-interviewing witnesses. Many of the original witnesses were elderly now, or had moved away, or had passed away. But some were still around. Mr. Carlson, the man who had been watering his lawn, was still alive, now 92 years old and living in a nursing home. Carver visited him. Carlson's memory was foggy, but he confirmed what he'd said in 1984. He thought he'd seen a girl in a pink sweater. He thought there had been a car on the street. Mrs. Delgado, who had noticed the dark sedan, had passed away in 2005. Carol Jensen, the woman who had called in the tip about the idling car, was located in Arizona. Carver called her. She remembered the incident clearly. She still believed the car had been suspicious. It wasn't much, but it was something. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In 2020, a man named Michael Brennan was arrested in Oklahoma for the attempted abduction of a child. During the investigation, police searched his home and found a collection of disturbing materials. Photographs of children, newspaper clippings about missing persons cases, a journal with detailed notes about surveillance and abduction techniques. One of the clippings was about Sarah Mitchell. Oklahoma police contacted the Houston Cold Case Unit. Detective Carver flew to Oklahoma to interview Brennan. Brennan was 58 years old. He had a long criminal history, including convictions for burglary, assault, and indecent exposure. He had served time in prison in the 1990s. He had been on the sex offender registry since 2003. Carver asked him about Sarah Mitchell. Brennan denied any involvement. He said he collected clippings about missing children because he found the cases interesting. He said it was a hobby. Carver didn't believe him. He obtained a warrant to search Brennan's property more thoroughly. In a storage unit rented under a false name, they found more materials, more photographs, more clippings, and a box of personal items that didn't belong to Brennan. Among them was a small pink hair clip. The hair clip was sent to the lab for analysis. DNA testing in 2020 was far more advanced than it had been in 1984. Even degraded samples could yield results. Even trace amounts of biological material could be analyzed. The clip was tested. DNA was found. Female, consistent with a child. The DNA was run through national databases. There was no match. But the Mitchells had provided DNA samples years earlier, when the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System was established. Those samples were still on file. The lab compared the DNA from the hair clip to Linda Mitchell's DNA. It was a match. The hair clip had belonged to Sarah. The discovery was both a breakthrough and a heartbreak. It confirmed that Michael Brennan had been involved in Sarah's disappearance, but it also meant that Sarah was almost certainly dead. No child survives 36 years in captivity. Carver called the Mitchells. Linda answered. "We found something," Carver said gently. A hair clip that belonged to Sarah. It was in the possession of a man named Michael Brennan. "We believe he was responsible for her abduction." Linda's breath caught. "Is she—" "We don't know yet," Carver said. "We're still investigating, but I wanted you to know that we're making progress." Linda hung up and collapsed into a chair. Robert sat beside her, silent, his face gray. They had waited 36 years for answers, and now finally they were coming. But the answers were not what they had hoped for. Michael Brennan was charged with kidnapping and murder. He continued to deny involvement, but the evidence was mounting. The hair clip, the clippings, the journal, his history of predatory behavior. Detectives dug into his past. In 1984, Brennan had been 22 years old. He had been living in Houston, working as a delivery driver. His route had taken him through the neighborhood where Sarah disappeared. He had no alibi for the afternoon of October 16, 1984. He owned a dark blue sedan. Detectives showed his photograph to the few remaining witnesses from 1984. No one could positively identify him, but no one could rule him out either. Carver's team searched for more evidence. They obtained records of Brennan's movements over the years. They looked for other potential victims. They searched properties he had lived on or had access to. In late 2021, they got a warrant to excavate a property in rural Texas where Brennan had lived in the late 1980s. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, forensic anthropologists. And in a shallow grave beneath an old shed, they found remains. The remains were those of a child, female, approximately 8 years old at the time of death. The bones were fragile, degraded by time and soil, but enough remained for analysis. DNA was extracted. It was compared to Linda Mitchell's DNA. It was a match. Sarah Mitchell had been found. The news broke in January 2022. Headlines across the country. Texas cold case solved after 38 years. Little girl who disappeared in 1984 finally found. Suspect arrested in decades-old abduction and murder. The Mitchells were contacted by reporters, but they declined to comment. Linda and Robert held each other in their living room, surrounded by photographs of the daughter they had lost so long ago. They cried, not tears of relief, not tears of closure, just tears, because Sarah was gone. She had been gone for 38 years, and now they knew she was never coming back. Michael Brennan was tried and convicted in 2023. The evidence was overwhelming: the hair clip, the remains, his history, his lack of alibi. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never confessed, never explained why, never showed remorse. The Mitchells attended the trial. They sat in the courtroom, silent, watching the man who had destroyed their lives. When the verdict was read, Linda closed her eyes. Robert squeezed her hand. It was over. Sarah Mitchell was laid to rest in a cemetery outside Houston. The funeral was small. Family, a few old friends, Detective Carver and his team. Linda placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the casket. Robert stood beside her, his face carved from stone. David flew in from California with his wife and children. It was the first time he'd been back to Texas in years. He introduced his kids to their grandparents. He told them about their aunt, the little girl who never came home from school. The truth, when it finally arrived, brought no peace, only certainty. Sarah Mitchell had been taken on October 16, 1984, by a predator who saw an opportunity and seized it. She had been murdered within hours of her abduction. Her body had been hidden in a place where no one thought to look. For 38 years she had been there, silent, waiting. Michael Brennan had continued his life. He had moved from place to place, committed other crimes, evaded justice. He had kept Sarah's hair clip as a trophy, a memento of what he had done. Fun till technology and persistence caught up with him. Linda Mitchell passed away in 2024, 2 years after Sarah's remains were found. She died peacefully in her sleep, in the house on Oakwood Drive, in the room next to Sarah's. Robert followed 6 months later. His heart, which had been broken in 1984, finally gave out. David inherited the house. He sold it. He couldn't bear to keep it. Before the sale, he went through Sarah's room one last time. He packed up her books, her stuffed animals, her photographs. He donated most of it. He kept a few things: a book about horses, a school photograph, the pink sweater. He took them back to California. He told his children the full story. About their aunt, about what had happened, about how long it had taken to find the truth. They listened, quiet and somber, and then they moved forward. Because that's what you do. You carry the weight of the past, but you don't let it stop you. Detective James Carver retired in 2025. Sarah Mitchell's case was the one he was most proud of, not because it had a happy ending. It didn't, but because it had an ending. Because a family finally got answers. Because a little girl was no longer lost. In Texas, on a quiet street that used to be called Oakwood Drive, new families live in the houses now. Children walk to school and back, just like Sarah once did. The neighborhood has changed. The world has changed. But some things remain. Memory. Loss. The stubborn refusal to forget. Sarah Mitchell was 8 years old when she disappeared. She never got to grow up, never got to become the writer she wanted to be, never got to live the life she deserved. But she is remembered. Not as a tragedy, not as a statistic, but as a child who mattered. A daughter, a sister, a person, and in the end, that is all any of us can hope for. To be remembered, to matter, to not be forgotten.